Welcome to the BUC Interview for the Times newsletter. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I can. My name is Julie Hawkins. I'm from the University of Reading, where I'm Professor of Plant Systematics and Evolution. Hello.
Lovely, lovely. As I say, welcome. What first sparked your interest in plants, and how did that early curiosity shape your path into botany? So 2 parts.
Okay. I think I'd always been interested in nature around me. And I didn't grow up in a particularly rural place. I grew up sort of 15 minutes walk from Gatwick Airport, but my parents had a medium-sized garden, and my mum would have thrown a handful of nasturtium seeds into a bed and it would be buzzing with pollinators. And I've got really strong memories of being really interested in spending time in the garden, and I looked at every plant and every insect that was there. I could have been an entomologist, it could have gone that way, but yeah, that being really engrossed by the drama. Actually, I found it a bit of a drama of the way that the plants and animals were interacting, and yeah, it really gripped me. But I remember we always used to plant some runner beans, and so the beans would be in the pot and I would be out every day watching the developmental sequence of the leaves as the plant grew, like fascinated by its climbing. So I was just really interested to see what nature there was in the garden and what was happening there. And I was strongly encouraged. My grandmother was very encouraging. She herself was interested in plants, and she told me how, as a child, she had entered a competition to make a herbarium of the wildflowers where she grew up, and that she had her herbarium displayed in the local library. So I knew I'd heard of a herbarium as a quite a little one, and heard this story about how excited she was to have won this competition. And I think about that a lot, because she grew up in a place now where to make a herbarium would be much more challenging. That was in London. But I had a little group of kids that I used to hang out with in the street as a kid as well. And she used to send us on little plant missions. So there would be like a 10-pence prize for the person who found the most, and then there would be a category. So I remember we did grasses. So the person who could find the most grass inflorescences would get 10-pence. And we were out for days.
Wonderful.
Looking for different grasses and comparing them. And I remember my friend's little brother, he was the one, are these 2 different or not? And I was like, yes, they are. But they weren't, and they weren't counted. So already we were engaged in the drama of, is this the same or not the same? So that was my grandmother encouraging me there. And no one in my direct family had gone to university, so I hadn't had that experience. But my grandmother's aunt and uncle were market gardeners in Kent, so they had a strawberry farm basically in Kent, and there was a scholarship for boys from market garden backgrounds to study natural sciences in Cambridge, and my grandmother's cousin got this scholarship and in fact became a botanist, and in fact a very successful one. Professor Peter Bell, he was the head of botany for many years at UCL, and had some very interesting stories. And she used to say to me, she said, if your cousin Peter can be a professor of botany, then you certainly can. So there was this sort of sense that it was something that you could do as well. And then from the other side of the family, from my dad's side, I was given this microscope, it's here behind me, when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I'll show Jonathan some of the slides, maybe he can make some photographs of them, but they are slide preparations that I made when I was in the middle of primary school. And I had cover slips, and they're little bits, they say things like geranium pollen, but geranium is spelt with a J and pollen has got 1 L, and it's like so I was quite engaged in this idea that I could look even more closely at plants, because I had This was my dad's auntie, worked as a school lab technician, and she gave me this old microscope that they were chucking out, and it was hours I spent with that thing. And I made like leaf peels and stems, you know, I was cutting things up and making slides. So yeah, so I kind of always was interested in nature. And then I had this chemistry teacher when I was doing my A levels. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to do plant sciences or botany. He said, don't do that. Do not do that. He said, it sounds awful, but you're too clever to do that. If you do that, you'll just end up measuring leaves. And I was like, oh. And so I applied to do this degree in biophysics. And I did that, actually. And I got to the end of it and I thought, well, that was quite interesting. It wasn't not enjoyable, but I kind of had this heart sickness that I really wanted to study plants, and I hadn't. So I went and did a master's degree in Birmingham, which was plant genetic resource conservation and utilisation. And I chose that master's degree because I thought, well, this is where I'll find out about plants, but it will also be about how people have interacted with plants and domesticated them and grown them and met their food needs and their other needs from plants. And I think even ever since I was planting little beans and watching them grow in the back garden, I was really drawn to wanting to know more about people and plants. So I did this master's degree. It did not have as much botany in it as I hoped, but there were little bits of botany which just blew my mind and really excited me. So we had a very small number of practicals. One of the lecturers in that master's was Richard Lester, very famous taxonomist of Solanaceae. And I remember he did a little practical on Solanaceae fruits, which really excited me because it was the thing that I was heartsick for, if you know what I mean. I really wanted someone to explain the morphology of plants to me. Anyway, so I did the master's degree. Richard Lester blew my mind by saying that a bell pepper was a dry berry, and I'm just like, I'll never get over the excitement of that moment. Because I really wanted to know this stuff. I really wanted to know it. The other person I met as a master's student was Jack Hawkes, and of course that is fascinating for someone who's interested in ethnobotany, because he was a contemporary of Vavilov and had known Vavilov and had gone to meetings with Vavilov. He was quite an old man. He was an emeritus professor, and he came in and he gave us like 4 lectures on that master's course. But you know, to have these lectures from someone who, like in the 30s, 40s, 50s, was traveling the world and collecting potatoes and interacting with people to find out about the diversity of cultivars, and you know, knowing Vavilov and talking about him was like really exciting. And then I went from Birmingham to Oxford, and that was very much a training in plant systematics. So big old chunk of field work. I was in Mexico and Central America for 5 months. I turned up, looked at lots of herbarium specimens, and then they put me in a Land Rover in Central America, and I drove around for 5 months doing this amazing collecting. I was working on leguminous trees, and the Colin Hughes, who's famously worked on incipient domestication taxonomy of Lucina, and started me off in the field. So that was a real amazing grounding in like classic botany. Just a wonderful experience to do that field work. And you know, I had some Spanish. I had some Spanish, that was okay, and I got really good about talking about trees and talking about Land Rover parts. I was like super expert in those 2 topics in Spanish. And for me, one of the biggest challenges was I'd not long got my driving test, and I drove from Honduras to the north of Mexico, across the Mexican border, back again, and then to Costa Rica and back. Once in flowering season and once in fruiting season, so twice in 5 months. Is a lot of miles. Yeah, I mean that sort of embedded me in the leguminosae. And the leguminosae community, so that then when I was finishing my PhD and looking for opportunities, there was an advert for something called the Smuts Fellowship, which is General Jan Smuts, as well as being a politician, was a botanist and in South Africa. And he endowed a fellowship that was sort of managed by University of Cape Town and Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden. And this was this I finished my PhD round about the time of the first free elections in South Africa. So after years of apartheid and cultural and sort of academic boycott, sort of doors were open to travel and work in South Africa. And this fellowship was advertised, and I remember asking Brian Schreier, who's another legume taxonomist from Kew, what would be the best legume project to do in South Africa, and he suggested something wildly ambitious. And so I wrote this grant proposal for this project that I used to do as a fellow in University of Cape Town, and sent that off, and I got the position, so wrapped up and packed up and set off to Cape Town. Again, amazing field opportunity. But I was working with Peter Linder, who went from University of Cape Town to Zurich Botanic Garden and has now retired, but he was an extraordinarily knowledgeable field botanist and more or less lived, spent so much time in the mountains of South Africa. And we would go out in most weekends as a group of botanists sort of around him, so other postdocs, master students, and so on, and just have the most amazing botanical adventures. Sort of a weekend after weekend, we'd be, at somewhere different. Some of them were quite ambitious environments to work in. I remember walking along a ridge in a storm, thinking, God, this is really intense. Are we going to survive? But it was, you'd go up with your bag and your rucksack and a bin liner, and as you went up, you just fill the bag with your botanical collections and watch tag them as you went up, and then just sleep out in the open at the top. You don't need a tent or anything, so just basically lie down and go to sleep, like cook, drink sweet tea, sleep in the mountain, and then walk down again. And yeah, isn't that amazing? So the plants I was working on then were it's genus Aspalathus, which is one of the large genera. There's some 280, 290 species, and it includes rooibos, redbush tea, Aspalathus linearis. So it was a great group to get into, but I was not in South Africa long enough to really make headway with it. So I kind of brought it back as a project that I continued when I left South Africa and came to Reading as a new lecturer. And in fact, one of my first PhD students continued the Aspalathus work. Yeah, so my sort of bread and butter and my background was, plant systematics and, taxonomic work, phylogenetics to inform classification. So very, very classic in that sense. And ethnobotany came a bit later. I had done the master's degree, which was really about people. And when I was doing all the collecting work in Mexico, we would always ask people, what do you call this plant? And, people would like to talk about the plant. So I got used to the idea that you would interact with people when you make your herbarium notes. Of course, I was working on the group Aspalathus, which has got a very important economic species in it. But the ethnobotany really started to grow some 10 years after I arrived in Reading. So it was a bit later.
So the two amazing experiences, Central and North America and South Africa, which really have shaped your path into botany. So tell me, when did ethnobotany come into focus for you?
Well, I'd say the first sort of 10 years at Reading, I was still very much in the plant systematics and evolution world. And then, I'm just trying to get the timeline right. I became a mum, and that put a different perspective on things. I was not going to go and do, it wasn't straightforward with given my circumstances to do a lot of field work. And I also felt that I needed to strike out into something that I could own a little bit more. And the work with the plant systematics and evolution, I was very much involved in sort of like traits and drivers of speciation, which was, so I'd moved a little bit more into evolution and a little bit away from classification. But there was very much this sense that there was a sort of body of people doing that work, and other people were the leaders of that work, and that it was rather difficult to get funding. And I felt that as a new mum who wasn't able to do much field work, that it was going to be hard to keep up, actually. And you have this thing, you know, that there's what I always call sort of methodological inflation, but that's a bit unfair. But you know, it's when you've got a field like that that's moving quite rapidly, there becomes a sense that if you're using last year's methods, you ain't going to publish in good journals, and there's a sense that keeping up is quite challenging. And about the same time, you know, for my job, I would have to provide somewhere between 5 and 10 undergraduate projects every year and supervise them. And yeah, students were coming to me and saying, I'm really interested in medicinal plants. Can you think of a project I could do? Can I do a project on medicinal plants with you? And I thought, oh, that's it. You know, I was interested in medicinal plants, but from a sort of, not from a research perspective at that time. And I started reading into the kinds of methods that ethnobotanists were using to understand medicinal plant diversity, because I thought, like an evolutionary biologist or a taxonomist, I was interested in indices of diversity and measures of diversity, phylogenetics. And I started reading about the work of Daniel Moorman, who was a hugely influential ethnobotanist, and he had studied the use of plants in medicine of Native American peoples, and he had started bringing in some sort of statistical tests to look at whether certain families of plants were used more or less than you'd expect, given their sort of standing diversity and availability. And I thought, oh, I can do something quite cool with this, with my phylogenetics. And that was in my mind, and I started to run little undergraduate projects that were about the diversity of medicinal plants. At roughly the same time, my head of school came to me, and he said, there's this new professor in the School of Pharmacy, and I think you'd get on with her, and I think it would be political to see if you can collaborate with her. Why don't you go and meet her? And that was the wonderful and great fun Liz Williamson, who had written sort of wonderful books of, you know, who was the authority on medicinal plants. The third piece of the jigsaw that moved me more into this work was that there's something called the John Speed and Lewis Foundation, which at that time were funding PhD studentships, and they had a call out for a PhD funding for research in medicinal plants. And I thought, let's put this third piece of the jigsaw here and devise a project that's about using phylogenetic methods to sort of like better understand the patterns of use of medicinal plants. So that was the beginning, really, and from there it grew, and it was brilliant for me because I had my hands full at work. I was not going to do at home, rather. I was not going to do big field trips, and I wasn't going to be hours at the bench. I needed something that I could drive using bits of time in the evening and bits of time at the weekend as and when. And I needed something where there wasn't a vast, quickly changing literature of methods that I had to keep up with. And it was brilliant because they were my methods. I was like, this is how you can investigate medicinal plant diversity using phylogeny. And it was really exciting times to get started with that. So the PhD went really well. That was Haris Saslis-Lakudakis, who was a fabulous PhD student and such a great pleasure to work with. And from there, we went on to a funded network with Nina Ronstedt, who is a brilliant manager, MedPlant, which was about phylogenetics and medicinal plants. Met some great collaborators. It was really important time, and really enjoyable.
Tell me, what inspires you about teaching botany and plant topics generally at Reading?
I love teaching. I'm on a mission for people who have not felt the plant joy to really look and just experience how amazing it is. And there's great opportunity there because the way the A-level syllabus works, there's not a lot of plant joy coming through as far as I'm concerned. And so people will come in to some of my part one and they may feel like, oh, it's the plant week. And my mission is for them to come out and go, that was the best thing. And that does happen. I had a student say to me just like a couple of weeks ago, he said, when we did the floral dissection and we looked at the diversity of flowers and what all the parts of flowers was, it was the best thing in the whole year. And I just think, because you hadn't looked. And when you look, it is mind-boggling how to look at the diversity and see it. And so I love doing that. And we have a lot of zoologists on our degree courses. I like them to it's a badge of pride for me to have them say that they liked the plants the best.
And I mean, I have similar from teaching different modules and so on, but it absolutely, it works. I mean, it absolutely works that you can show them. And I think your point there about looking and observing, because botany can allow you I mean, entomology probably the same, but to look, to observe, to really look, to really use your eyes and to put two and two together and make four, and to understand what this structure is for and why it's so amazing.
You can be so curious if you just start looking at the plants that are around you. Each one's got its story and its way of being, and you can have an encounter with any plant as you walk to the car park or the pub or whatever. There's going to be a plant to encounter on the way, and it will have its little story, and you can meet it. That is fantastic.
And I think the botanist the teaching botanist, just as you've described there, can open that door for students, and it's not difficult. It can easily stay closed, but if you've got somebody that opens that door, and once you're in, you have a much more interesting, fascinating, beautiful life.
I couldn't agree more, actually. And I also think, I've got this whole story. Oh yeah, I was 6 in the garden looking at nasturtiums, and all of that is true. But you can start looking at any time. You don't have to have this narrative of, my grandmother's cousin was a botanist and blah. You can just start looking at any time.
Absolutely can.
And it's all there for you to enjoy.
It is, and it works, because I've seen that with students. You've seen it with students, and absolutely, it's the most important thing I think we can do in terms of botany teachers. Brilliant, that's fantastic. Thank you. So we'll move on a little bit also about teaching. Okay. I'll change. Something
Yeah,
went
whatever.
ping, so I looked away. We're delighted that you will be chairing the Botanical University Challenge finals on the 19th of August. So you
Yeah,
will
I
have these
know. The
amazing students
responsibility.
there competing, and you will be asking the questions. So what are you most looking forward to with that experience, that new experience for you?
Oh gosh. Well, it's obviously a huge honor and privilege to be invited, and I just think it would be exciting to meet everyone actually, and to hear their stories, because they will all bring their stories of the plants that, or the people, or the ideas that have brought them to where they are, and I love hearing people's plant stories actually. So yeah, I'm just really happy to be able to meet them.
Fantastic. And we're really looking forward to having you there. And also, you will be taking an ethnobotany walk on the Thursday, I think, of that week. So do you want to give us a little bit of, what can we be looking forward to? What can the students that have already signed up for that walk, and
Oh,
I've talked to
good.
some of them, what can they expect? Just a flavour.
I think we'll do some walking and talking. We'll pause under a tree and take some time with a small number of species to really get to know them and think about where they've come from, how they've come to be with us, what parts of their stories have embedded into our folklore, what are the stories from far-flung places that we may or may not have heard. It's I'm going to have to take a little walk around and choose some favourites, because there's a risk that you've got too much to say about too many things. And
But I think for sure, if you take that approach, you will get conversations with those students, because those students
yeah,
will have selected to be on the ethnobotany walk.
oh,
You're doing it
totally.
twice, and
Mm.
that I think will be so a lot of it will just organically
Yeah,
evolve on the
it's going to be
walk.
a conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think
Yeah,
that's going to be really exciting. So you'll find those two activities, chairing and the ethnobotany walk, quite different, but both
oh yeah,
inspiring. Both
yes,
inspiring.
totally. Looking forward to it.
So the last question, Julie, thank you very much for the interview. But the last question that we often ask, and you may well not have a favorite, but do you have a favorite plant? If so, or if not, please explain.
Such a hard question, because there are so many possible answers of plants that I could argue were favourites, but I hardly know where to begin. But I sort of came round to thinking about those runner beans, because as a, it sounds a bit silly perhaps, but as a child, I loved those plants. I just loved them. I would run out every day to see what they were doing, and and as you through years you learn more about them, and the story of domestication, and the story of their introduction to Europe, and the people who've not processed them properly and poisoned themselves, and there's it's just exemplifies the number of stories that a plant can have. So many, because it's a
Yeah,
plant that people have domesticated and done so much with.
yeah, I love that. I love that answer, because it's an unusual answer in a way, because you're going right back to your childhood. But then
Mm,
it's a plant whose story you knew little about then, but you were fascinated, has
yeah,
then shown on your pathway through
that's right.
botany, through
Do you know?
fieldwork and research. The
Yeah, it was
stories have
like that.
unfolded before you, and they still
Do
continue
you know?
to.
I've also got this wow experience, and I'm going back now, and I would have been before school, so I may be three, probably about, I would say three, and we went to visit some family friends, and they had an allotment, and Uncle John took me to the allotment, and he showed me a broad bean plant growing, and he opened the broad bean to show me the beans inside the broad bean, and it honestly blew my mind. I was just like, oh my God, look at these beans in this amazing sort of like cloud-like fluffy nest of perfectness. And it's almost, I can put myself back into that 3-year-old thing of like, wow. Isn't that wow? And he also dug up some potatoes, and that blew my mind as well, because to watch them bubble up out of the ground. And then as an adult you read the Seamus Heaney poem about digging up potatoes, and you think digging up potatoes is this very primal experience of the way the earth come out of the earth. There's a reason why someone's written a poem that's so powerful about digging up potatoes. The first time I saw it, I was amazed, and I was just this little kid in an allotment.
I have a request for you. Can you either now or send me a recording of you reading the poem? I don't actually.
And
then we can have that in as well. I can slot it in, because that's beautiful. I mean, and again, that just goes back to your interest in people and plants and culture, poems.
And it's
and
a beautiful
I really
poem, actually.
Yeah, you were
but it's quite a melancholic poem. It's about how the tool of his trade is the pen, and there's his father with his fork. It's kind of beautiful, actually. I've got a poetry book called Flora Poetica, which is organised taxonomically. Fantastic book.
Actually, so much. But I mean, you clearly, as a child, were very observant, very inquisitive, and plants were a big focus. Interesting entomology as well. It wasn't just the plants, however, the plants.
I was very interested in the insects as well, because they were the other thing that was there. You could look at. You could find. You could look at.
Yeah. Good. Right. Well, I think it just remains for me to say thank you for all those fascinating answers and to the questions. And we, again, really look forward to seeing you for Botanical University Challenge. So, Julia Hawkins, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jonathan. Bye.